On the night of the 24th of July, 1953, a 19-year-old Australian sergeant lay in a machine gun bunker on Hill 111 and watched Chinese infantry climb up through the wire below him. Shells had been coming down on the position for hours, and several of the Marine trenches out in front had already gone under. Around the sergeant crouched a section of medium machine gunners from the 2nd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, pushed forward to hold the western approach to the hook beside the Americans. His guns were firing on fixed lines into the dark, hammering the slope where the attack had to come, and it wasn't slowing the assault by much. The Chinese were inside the forward positions now, nearer with every minute, and Hill 111 was close to gone. Brian Cooper was the sergeant's name. He commanded one of 4 gun sections in the battalion's medium machine gun platoon, and his Vickers guns had gone up onto Hill 111 to back the left forward company on the hook and to sweep the western ground the Chinese would need if they meant to break the line. The hill sat about a kilometer southwest of the hook itself, a low and stripped lump of ground with the American main line running off to his left toward Boulder City. By the small hours of the 25th, it had turned into one of the most dangerous patches of earth anywhere in Korea, and Cooper could feel it sliding out of his grip. He'd done everything the gunnery had taught him, and still, the attack kept coming on, wave behind wave, out of the dark below. Beside Cooper, the hook itself was still holding. The 2nd Battalion had taken the crescent-shaped ridge over the month before, relieving the British battalion that had held the ground through the last big fight of the spring. A single Australian battalion now sat across the most exposed corner of the entire United Nations line, and coming at them through the dark was the 137th Division of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, flung forward in strength on a front the rest of the war had long since settled. An armistice had already been agreed at the talks. The date for the signing was set, only days away, and both sides knew it down to the hour. By the summer of '53, the hook had earned itself a hard name. The Americans had held it through the first battle in October of '52, the Black Watch through the second in November, the Duke of Wellington's regiment through the brutal fighting of late May. British losses on its slopes had run higher than on any other single feature in the whole Korean War, a toll paid mostly by the Commonwealth battalions sent up to hold it. Cooper himself would later reckon the hook had cost more lives on both sides than anything else in the country. 3 times the Chinese had come for it, and 3 times they'd been thrown back. And now they were coming a 4th time with the clock running down. On Hill 111 there was next to nothing left to throw at them. The forward trenches had gone under, the wire was breached in front, and the Chinese had worked in among the weapon pits, too close now for the guns to turn on them. Cooper had a single option left to him, and he knew exactly what it was. He took hold of the field telephone to call the divisional artillery down onto the very hill he was standing on, with his own gunners still out in the open pits around him. What he did in the next few minutes would settle whether Hill 111 held or fell. The men on that hill had come a long way to reach it. 2 RAR had sailed into Busan aboard the New Australia in March of '53, and from the moment the ship came alongside the wharf, the men could see what 3 years of war had done to the country. They joined the 28th Commonwealth Brigade, part of the 1st Commonwealth Division under Major General Michael West, holding a stretch of the static front the soldiers called the Jamestown Line. For months, their work had been night patrols out into no man's land, north of the wire, picking through the broken hills around the Imjin and the Samichon Rivers. It was a strange, half-buried sort of war, and it was the only one this generation of Australians would come to know in Korea. By the middle of '53, the war had stopped moving altogether. The front had set into trenches and dugouts, much like the ground their fathers had known a generation before, and the fighting came at night, in the gap between the lines. Australian infantry fitted that kind of war the way they usually did. They were loose in the rear areas, slow to salute, and quick with a nickname for an officer, and the talk among them ran to the food and the flies more than to the enemy across the valley. Out on patrol it changed, because they went quiet on the ground and steady in an ambush, and the discipline that never showed itself on parade showed in the dark. The line wore at a man even before the main attack came. Chinese harassing fire ran on without a pause, a few rounds at a time, enough to keep heads down in the holes and to send the odd casualty back down the hill. The heat sat heavy in the cut earth, the wet got into everything through the monsoon weeks, and the trenches kept filling and caving in. None of it matched the war the newsreels back home had shown, and all of it had to be borne while the wire went back up and the bunkers went back together. The men came to learn the ground by the feel of it in the dark, every sap and shell hole and listening post fixed in the memory long before they could make it out by eye. The hook itself was a crescent of high ground west of the Samichon, a river that fed down into the Imjin. It rose only 120 meters or so, low by the measure of the Korean hills, and yet it sat at the very point where the United Nations main line bent sharply away from the river valley. From its crest, a defender could see deep into the Chinese rear, and to the south, the ground fell away toward the Imjin, some 4 kilometers off, where the old road ran down to Seoul. Whoever held the hook held the door into the valley, and the Chinese badly wanted that door open. That was the whole reason the feature had soaked up so much blood already, in fight after fight that settled nothing, and only had to be done again. The price of that ground had been paid many times over by the men sent to hold it. United States Marines fought the first battle on the hook in October of '52 and held on. The Black Watch fought the second in November and held it through 11 hours of close work in the dark. When the Duke of Wellington's regiment fought the third in late May, Chinese guns put more than 20,000 shells onto the position across 10 days, 11,000 of them in a single night. Each time the ground was churned into something out of the First World War, and each time it was patched up and handed on to the next battalion in the line, a little more ruined than before. The Australians took the hook over in July and inherited a ruin. Defensive wire and minefield fences had to be almost wholly rebuilt, and because the Chinese watched the slopes by day, the work could only be done after dark. On the 14th, a heavy rain came down across the Samichon Valley and caved in several of the bunkers, and the men trapped inside one of them had to be dug out while they could still be reached. Conditions in the trenches turned to the same mud the First World War had known, except that here the heat and the wet pressed on a man like a second uniform. They were still digging and wiring when the word from the peace talks reached the line. An Australian ran the brigade. Brigadier John Wilton pushed his 2 strongest battalions out toward the front, with 2 RAR under Lieutenant Colonel George Larkin taking the hook and the high ground on the left, while 3 RAR, the 3rd Battalion, held the line on the right across the river. British Centurion tanks were brought up behind the crest and dug in hull down, where their guns could fire straight down the approaches, and the machine gun platoon set its Vickers on fixed lines to sweep the folds of ground the field guns couldn't reach. The Chinese had picked this ground 4 separate times because it mattered, and the brigade laid out its defense in the knowledge that the next blow would land in the same place. Every gun and every fixed line was registered with that one certainty in mind. On the 19th of July, the negotiators at Panmunjom finished their work. The terms were agreed, and the date for the signing was set for the 27th, so that after 3 years of fighting and 2 years of talks that had dragged on while men were still taken in the hills, the war suddenly had an end marked on the calendar. Every man on the line could count the days down now, and for the first time, the talk in the trenches turned to going home rather than to the next patrol out into the dark. The Chinese were counting too, and they reached a decision of their own. They'd take the hook before the guns fell silent, so they could carry the ground to the table and call it their own. There was a cold logic behind that decision. The armistice would freeze the front more or less where the 2 armies stood when the firing stopped, which turned every hill and every yard of ground into something worth fighting for in the final days. A feature seized in the last week would sit on the right side of the line for good, and a feature lost would be lost for keeps. So the hook, which held little real value once the shooting ended, became worth 1 more division on the very eve of peace. Both armies understood the arithmetic, and both meant to be standing on the high ground when the clocks ran out. On the same evening the talks closed, the Chinese opened their bid for the hook. Their infantry came out of the dark against the Marines on the left and took 2 outposts named Berlin and East Berlin, and the loss bent the line so that the hook now jutted out further than before, a salient with the enemy pressing on three sides. The same shelling reached the Australian machine gun section out on Hill 111, the very guns Cooper would soon command, and it took one man and wounded three more. After that, the harassing fire never let up, by day or by night, wearing at the defenses and sending men back to the aid post one and two at a time. Anyone who felt the weight of it understood the main blow was still on its way. Through the days that followed, the signs piled up one on another. Patrols clashed out in no man's land on 4 separate nights, and air reconnaissance picked up Chinese troops and stores massing west of the Samichon. By working in the dark, the enemy had already found the seam they wanted, the boundary between the United States Marines and the 28th Commonwealth Brigade, the join between two armies and the softest point in any line. Their guns sat in a half-circle of hills opposite the hook, hidden in tunnels, run out to fire, and hauled back inside before the counter-battery could answer. The Australians and the Marines dug deeper and waited for it. By the 24th, the waiting had a hard edge to it. The forward companies stood to in the half-light each dusk, the gun lines checked their defensive fire tasks one more time, and the tank crews sat up behind the crest with their sights laid on the approaches. Out across the valley, the Chinese guns had gone quiet in a way the old hands had learned to mistrust, the lull that tended to come before a heavy attack. Word came back from the patrols that the enemy assembly areas were filling, and the brigade knew the wait was nearly done. Every man on the hook understood that the next night, or the one after, the 137th Division would be coming for them. It began on the evening of the 24th. Small parties of Chinese infantry came forward first, probing the Australian positions, feeling along the wire for a soft spot, and each one was caught and engaged before it could work in among the trenches. Then, just before 9, the artillery opened in earnest, and behind it, the infantry came on in real numbers. The weight of it fell on Hill 121 and the hook, held by the Australians, and on Hill 111 and the main line, held by the Marines with Cooper's gun section among them. So the fourth battle for the hook had begun in the dark. Out in front of the wire, the Australians fought the assault off in the dark. The forward companies of 2 RAR held their pits and fired into the Chinese coming up through the scrub, while the guns walked their rounds back and forth across the open ground ahead of them, dropping in close to the wire each time the infantry called for it. Wave after wave came on, each one feeling for a gap, each one broken up before it reached the trenches, and the slope in front of the Australian line filled with the noise of it. On the hook, the line gave a little, but never opened, and the men on it stayed low and let the artillery carry the weight. Behind them, the New Zealand and British gunners worked straight through the night without a halt, the gun barrels too hot to lay a hand on by the small hours. On the hook, the breaking of the attack was done mostly by the guns. Artillery from the 1st Commonwealth Division and from the United States Marine Division came down in front of the wire in a weight the attackers couldn't cross, and the New Zealand gunners of the 16th Field Battery laid their fire across the forward slopes all night. Behind the crest, the British Centurions fired straight down the approaches, their machine guns raking the gullies the Chinese used to form up in. Each wave that started up the slope ran into that wall, and most of it never reached the Australian positions at all. The infantry's job was to hold the line and call down the corrections that kept the fire where it was needed. On Hill 111, it went a good deal harder. The Chinese pressed there with more weight, took several of the Marines' forward trenches, and worked in among the positions until the hill was all but lost. That was the moment Cooper had reached for the telephone, with the enemy already past his forward guns. He called the divisional artillery down onto his own ground, knowing his section was still out in the open weapon pits when the shells would arrive. At 19 years of age, he had a quiet word with the man upstairs, asking that if it came to that, it be quick, and that the guns go easy on his blokes. The shells came down right where he'd asked for them. Out in the open, the Chinese had no cover at all, while the men down in the weapon pits had at least a little, and the barrage tore the assault apart on the forward slope before it could reach the crest. Hill 111 held through it, and the gun line had done what no weight of rifles alone could have managed. For that night's work, Cooper would be awarded the military medal, though the award lay a long way off from the man crouched in the pit while his own shells came down. The Marines spent the day that followed climbing back into the trenches they'd lost and patching what they could before dark came again. Daylight on the 25th brought no rest with it. Soon after 8 in the morning, the Chinese threw a company at the Marines on Hill 119, and American guns and mortars cut it down before it got far up the slope. The fighting rolled along the line through Boulder City and the forward slopes, and the Chinese artillery never stopped, dropping harassing fire on the Australian and Marine trenches to wreck the repair work by day. By late afternoon, something near 13,500 mortar and artillery rounds had come down on the American sector alone. Both sides knew the night still to come would be the worse of the two. By the second day, the men on the hook were running on next to nothing. They'd had no real sleep since the probing started, the shelling never let them finish a repair, and word had reached the trenches that the armistice was barely a day away. There was a particular cruelty in that, in fighting for a hilltop with the peace already signed and sitting on the calendar, and the men felt the unfairness of it even as they got on with the work. The men didn't dwell on it for long all the same. They patched the bunkers they could reach, kept their heads down through the harassing fire, and got themselves ready for the night they all knew was coming. After dark, the weight of shells climbed again, and by 11 o'clock there were more than 30 a minute coming down on Hill 121 and the Australian mortar position. At 11:15, the last offensive of the entire Korean War began. The Chinese came once more at Hill 111 and the Marine front, and they came at the contact bunker, the strong point between the two hills that guarded the way up to Hill 121. Everything the 137th Division had left in it went into that final push. There would be no holding anything back now on either side of the wire. They reached the Australian wire, and there they were stopped. The United Nations guns put down a weight of fire that nothing on foot could walk through, and the waves broke apart in the open ground short of the trenches. 2 RAR held its line through the worst of it and never gave up a yard of ground. The Chinese came on again, the shelling answered them again, and their infantry went down in heaps on the slopes below the Australian positions. By 3 in the morning, on the 26th, with the slopes below the wire heaped and no sign of a gap anywhere in the Australian line, the Chinese command had seen enough of it. The senior commanders called the offensive off. Their 137th Division had been broken on the wire, and the guns, spent for a hilltop it never came close to taking, and with the armistice now only hours away, there was nothing more to be won by feeding men into the same fire. The barrage slackened, the surviving infantry pulled back into the dark, and along the Australian line, the firing fell away to the odd round and a long, settling quiet. What the men in the trenches didn't yet know was that the war itself was nearly over, that within a day, the order to cease fire would run down the whole length of the front. They knew only that the attacks had stopped. What the daylight showed them on the 26th was hard to take in. Somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 of the Chinese fallen lay across the valley floor and around the contested ground of Hill 111 and the contact bunker and the Marine line. Their wounded, by the estimate, ran past 10,000, though the true count was never set down and never will be, lost with the division that had spent them. The valley that had been all noise for 2 days had gone still, and the quiet of it was almost as hard to bear as the racket had been. For the men of 2 RAR climbing out of their bunkers to look at it, the sight below was close to horror. The cost on the line that held was set down in the plainest terms. 2 RAR had 5 men gone and 24 wounded, and 2 of the wounded later passed from their injuries. The Marines of the 7th Regiment, holding the heavier and far more exposed ground to the left, had 43 men gone and 316 wounded. Australians and Americans had held different corners of the same hill. The harder corner had fallen to the Marines, and between them, the two forces had broken a whole division. Across the earlier battles, the hook had taken a savage toll from the men defending it, and this time that toll fell almost wholly on the men sent up the slope to seize it. The weight of guns the Chinese brought against the hook ran past anything Australians had stood under earlier in the war. By the reckoning of the official history, the artillery thrown at the 2 Australian battalions at the Samichon outweighed what had come down on them at Mariangsan, and the combined power of the American and Commonwealth guns answering it ran higher than anything brought to bear at Kapyong. The hook held because the men on it kept more steel in the air than the men climbing the slope could walk through. That had been the lesson of all 4 battles on the feature. The Australians had taken it to heart well before the 137th Division arrived in front of them. The truce came the very next morning. At 10 o'clock on the 27th of July, the armistice was signed at Panmunjom, and it took effect at 10 that night. When the hour came, the guns along the whole front fell quiet, and the silence that followed ran for miles in every direction, the first true quiet that ground had known in the better part of 2 years. The Battle of the Samichon River was over, and with it the last large action Australians would fight in the Korean War, the closing note of 3 years of hard work on the peninsula. As a battle honor, the Royal Australian Regiment would carry the Samichon away with it for good. 2 days after the gun stopped, men of 2 RAR walked freely across the top of the hook, the same ground where a man could be taken in a heartbeat only the week before. They carried timber and surplus ammunition down off the hill and handed the heavy armored vests back into company stores. A war correspondent photographed them strolling down the open slope in plain view, on ground no man had crossed upright in daylight for the better part of a year. The shape of the hill hadn't changed at all, and yet it had become an ordinary feature again, just a rise of dirt above a river. The hook was only a hill once more. Brian Cooper came home in April of 1954. While he'd been away in Korea, a young woman named Margaret had begun writing to him, the way letters from home found their path to lonely soldiers all through that war. They'd become pen friends across the distance, and when he got back to Australia, the 2 of them married. He was barely 20 by then. With a military medal put away in a drawer for the night he'd spent calling the guns down on his own head, and a wife he had first met by post, he didn't talk much about the hill.